The harsh laughter cut through the morning air at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado like shrapnel. Alexis Morgan struggled with the heavy gear bag, her small frame straining against the 70-pound load of tactical equipment. The weight pulled at old injuries, sending familiar sparks of pain through nerve endings that never quite healed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hey there, pipsqueak. Let the real operators handle this. Lieutenant Commander Jackson's voice boomed across the training ground. His hands shoved her shoulder hard enough to make her stumble. 4 young SEAL trainees in crisp uniforms circled her like predators sensing weakness. The smell of salt air and arrogance rolled off them in waves, mixing with the morning mist and seawater. Support personnel aren't authorized to touch operator equipment. Jackson jabbed his finger at the specialist rank insignia on Alexis's collar, his face twisted with contempt. Get away from my gear now. Alexis rose slowly, her hands trembling. Not from fear, but from something deeper that she had buried for 3 long years. She met Jackson's gaze with eyes that held secrets he couldn't begin to fathom. Dark eyes that had seen things these fresh-faced SEALs only encountered in their worst nightmares. I have orders to prep all equipment before 0800 hours, she said, her voice coming out rough like gravel grinding against steel. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training ground, highlighting the careful way she moved, as if every step required conscious thought. Jackson's laugh was cruel and sharp. He shoved her again, harder this time, the force jarring through her slight frame. I don't give a damn about your orders, princess. This gear belongs to real warriors. They had no idea that every piece of equipment she touched carried the weight of 8 souls who never made it home. They couldn't know about the unbearable truth of why she alone survived to remember them, or the classified operation that had transformed her from one of the military's elite into a ghost hiding in plain sight. The other SEALs joined in, their juvenile behavior escalating as they fed off each other's energy. What's wrong with your hands? One of them sneered, noticing the slight tremor she couldn't completely hide. Too much caffeine this morning? Alexis bent to retrieve the spilled equipment, her movements practiced and efficient despite the pain that shot through her right shoulder. As her sleeve rolled up, a long jagged scar became visible on her forearm, pale against her tan skin. The mark was distinctive, not the clean line of surgery, but the chaotic pattern of shrapnel and fire. Nice scar, the youngest SEAL's voice dripped with mockery. What happened? Cut yourself in the mess hall kitchen? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The group erupted in laughter, each trying to outdo the other with clever insults. Alexis said nothing, just continued sorting the equipment with precision that seemed almost ritualistic. She counted each item, checked serial numbers, arranged them in the bag with the kind of care usually reserved for handling explosives. It was the attention to detail of someone who understood that in combat, one faulty piece of gear could mean the difference between life and death. Someone who had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Jackson watched her movements with growing irritation. There was something about the way she handled the equipment that bothered him, though he couldn't quite place what it was. She moved with too much familiarity, too much confidence for a simple support specialist. Then, he saw them. As Alexis reached for another piece of gear, her dog tags slipped out from beneath her uniform for just a moment before she quickly tucked them back. He caught a glimpse of text etched into the metal. The letters to Zivgru were barely visible, worn from years of wear, but unmistakable to anyone who knew special operations. What's this? Jackson's voice took on a predatory tone, sensing new ammunition for his cruelty. You trying to play dress up with someone else's tags? He stepped closer, invading her personal space with the confidence of someone who'd never been truly challenged. The morning air grew thick with tension as Alexis's jaw tightened. But she continued her work with mechanical precision. Without thinking, she began a visual inspection of the tactical gear, her eyes automatically tracking stress points and checking for wear patterns. The movements were so natural, so unconscious that they seemed like muscle memory from thousands of hours of operations. The realization hit Jackson like a physical blow. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice rose to a near shout, drawing attention from across the training ground. "You think you're some kind of operator?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Alexis had pulled out a small notebook and was making notations, following what looked like a pre-mission checklist from memory. It was too much for Jackson's ego to bear a support specialist, the lowest of the low in his mind, daring to act like she understood his world. Jackson snatched the checklist from her hands, tearing it into pieces with theatrical rage. The torn paper fluttered to the ground like dying moths, each piece carrying away another fragment of the life Alexis had once lived. "You want to pretend you're an operator? You want to play warrior?" His face had turned red, veins standing out on his neck like battle lines drawn in flesh. The other SEALs formed a semicircle behind him, feeding off his anger, their mob mentality growing stronger. With each passing second, what had started as morning routine was escalating into something darker, something that would expose secrets buried deeper than any of them could imagine. Alexis bent down to gather the torn pieces of paper, her back to them, shirt pulling tight. Across her shoulders, through the fabric, just for a moment, the hint of black ink became visible complex, patterns that spoke of artistry and meaning far beyond anything these young SEALs could comprehend. And in that moment, as the California morning sun climbed higher and the shadows grew shorter, none of them realized they were standing at the precipice of a revelation that would change everything they thought they knew about heroism, sacrifice, and the true cost of war. The torn paper pieces scattered in the morning breeze, carrying with them the last remnants of Alexis's carefully constructed anonymity. "Oh, look, she's got tattoos too," the SEAL with Lieutenant's bars laughed, pointing at the brief glimpse of ink through Alexis's uniform. "What is it, a butterfly? A heart with Mom written in it. How precious." The mockery came from all sides now, each SEAL trying to score points with Jackson by being crueler than the last. Alexis stood slowly, the torn papers clutched in her hands, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining control. For the first time, emotion flickered across her face. But it wasn't fear or shame. It was something older, deeper, a weariness that spoke of battles fought in places these young SEALs had only seen in movies. Places where the enemy didn't announce themselves with uniforms and radio chatter. "Don't touch my things," she said, quietly, but there was steel in her voice that made the laughter falter for just a moment. Jackson, however, was too far gone in his power trip to notice the warning. He grabbed the torn papers from her hands and threw them into the wind with dramatic flair. "Or what? You'll report me? You'll run crying to your support sergeant?" He was performing now, playing to his audience of fellow SEALs who hung on his every word. The morning had turned into theater with Alexis cast as the victim and Jackson as the conquering hero. Around them, other personnel had begun to notice the commotion, but none dared to intervene. Jackson's reputation for vindictiveness was well known throughout the base. Alexis's hands shook as she reached into her medical kit, extracting military-grade pain medication that cost more than regular painkillers. The prescription neurological drugs were the only pharmaceuticals that kept her damaged nerves stable enough for the precise work she needed to perform daily. Years of chronic pain had taught her to manage the worst of it, but stress always made everything worse. She dry swallowed 2 pills with practiced efficiency, a motion that spoke of countless mornings just like this one, fighting through pain that others couldn't see or understand. Jackson's eyes lit up with malicious glee. "Pills too? What's wrong? Can't handle a little physical labor without your drugs?" He shoved her away from the gear with unnecessary force, his hands rough against her shoulders. "Get away from my equipment. You don't deserve to even look at it." The shove was harder than necessary, meant to humiliate as much as move her. Alexis stumbled backward, her boot catching on the uneven ground. As she fell, her backpack spilled open, its contents scattering across the dirt like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. The items that tumbled out told a story the SEALs were too blind to read. A worn field manual for underwater demolition, its pages marked and annotated in margins with notes that spoke of real experience. An old dive computer with a cracked screen, but obviously well-maintained, the kind of equipment that serious operators kept as backup. And then there was the photograph, half-burned and carefully preserved. It showed a group of people in tactical gear, standing in front of a nondescript building. Their faces were obscured by fire damage, but their posture spoke of elite training and unbreakable bonds. "Look at this." Jackson picked up the damaged photo, waving it in the air like a trophy. Wannabe operator carries around pictures of real warriors. "What is this, your fan collection?" He examined the photo more closely, his expression shifting from mockery to curiosity despite himself. The team in the image was unlike any standard SEAL unit, and something about the photograph seemed significant in a way he couldn't quite grasp. "That's supposed to be some special ops unit?" Jackson's question came out half mocking, half curious. The other SEALs gathered around to look, their juvenile behavior momentarily forgotten in the face of something that seemed genuinely mysterious. Alexis's response was barely audible, forced out through clenched teeth like a confession extracted under torture. "Operation Hammerfall, November 2022. The words fell into the morning air like stones into still water, creating ripples of unease among the gathered SEALs. Across the training ground, an older man in tactical gear suddenly went very still. Commander Rivera had been walking past, heading to his own team, but those words stopped him cold. He turned slowly, his weathered face showing the kind of recognition that comes from touching something classified and dangerous. Rivera had been operating long enough to know when someone spoke about things that weren't supposed to exist. Operations that never appeared in official records. "What did you just say?" Rivera's voice cut through the group's chatter like a blade through silk. Jackson, annoyed at the interruption of his entertainment, waved dismissively. "This support wannabe is pretending she knows about some operation. Probably saw it in a movie." But Rivera wasn't listening to Jackson anymore. His attention was fixed entirely on Alexis, on the way she knelt in the dirt, gathering her scattered possessions, with the careful precision of someone handling sacred artifacts. He'd seen that look before in the eyes of operators who'd been places and done things that never made it into their official service records. Jackson grabbed Alexis by the upper arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. "Let me explain something to you, Princess. Real warriors earn their place. We don't pretend. We don't play dress up. And we sure as hell don't let support personnel touch our equipment." The shove that followed was violent, intended to hurt and humiliate. An equal measure. Jackson pushed Alexis hard into the side of a tactical vehicle, the metal edge of an access panel catching her uniform shirt. The sound of tearing fabric cut through the morning air like a gunshot. Alexis twisted away from the vehicle's hull, trying desperately to minimize the damage, but it was too late. The tear ran from her shoulder to mid-back, revealing what she'd spent 3 years hiding from the world. The tattoo was massive, covering most of her back in intricate black ink that seemed to move in the morning light. A trident rose from stylized waves, its prongs spread wide in defiant resilience, but it was the details within the design that made Commander Rivera take an involuntary step backward. 8 stars were woven into the trident's shaft, each one carefully placed with mathematical precision. Each star bore a name too small to read from a distance, but clearly visible to anyone who looked closely enough. Across the bottom, in military script that looked like it had been carved rather than tattooed, were the words that changed everything. Operation Hammerfall KIA 2022. Holy, one of the young SEALs breathed, the word dying in his throat, as the significance began to dawn on him. This wasn't some wannabe's fantasy tattoo picked from a parlor wall. This was a memorial, a living gravestone etched in flesh and ink. The kind of tribute that only someone who'd been there, who'd survived, when others hadn't, would carry on their body like a burden and an honor combined. The morning seemed to pause, even the distant sound of helicopters fading as everyone stared at the revealed artwork. Alexis tried desperately to pull the torn fabric close to cover what should never have been seen, but the damage was done. The tattoo was too large, too significant to hide now that it had been exposed to the light. Commander Rivera stepped forward, his face pale beneath his tactical cap. Years of classified operations had taught him to recognize the real thing when he saw it, and what he was looking at now made his blood run cold. That's a Devigru memorial tattoo. His voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what those words meant. Who knew the price that kind of ink represented? Impossible, Jackson sputtered, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. He was smart enough to know that Rivera didn't speak lightly about such things. The commander had been operating for 20 years, had seen enough classified operations to recognize authentic military artistry when it stood before him. She's just... But the words died as Rivera raised a hand for silence, his attention completely focused on the intricate memorial covering Alexis's back. Do you have any idea what Operation Hammerfall was, Lieutenant? Rivera's question was quiet, but carried more authority than any shout could have managed. When Jackson shook his head, Rivera continued, his eyes never leaving the tattoo that told a story of sacrifice and loss. November 12, 2022. A Devigru team went down during a classified operation in Somalia. 8 operators on board. He paused, the weight of his next words visible on his weathered face. Officially, there were no survivors. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye turned to Alexis, who stood with her back exposed to the morning, tears running silently down her face. The torn uniform hung like broken wings, revealing not just the tattoo, but a network of shrapnel scars that traced across her skin like a map of hell itself. These weren't the clean scars of surgery or the simple marks of accident. These were the chaotic patterns left by IEDs and fragmenting metal. The signature of someone who'd been inside a firefight as it became a slaughter around them. Someone who'd stayed when any sane person would have fled. Jackson's face had gone from red to white, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist in the desert heat. That's not. She can't be. But even as he stammered his denial, more details became visible. The tattoo artist had been a master craftsman, working the memorial design around existing scars, incorporating them into the trident's form. It was a work of art born from tragedy, beauty carved from unbearable loss. Rivera, what the hell is going on here? A new voice cut through the frozen tableau. Captain Sarah Matthews, callsign Phantom, strode across the training ground with the purposeful gait of someone who'd spent decades in command. Her eyes took in the scene in an instant, the torn uniform, the exposed tattoo, the circle of stunned SEALs, and Alexis Morgan standing at the center of it all, looking like she wanted the earth to swallow her whole. Rivera's voice was steady but urgent as he addressed his commanding officer. "Ma'am, I think we found Spectre." The words hit Matthews like a physical blow. Her steady stride faltered, and for just a moment, the iron control that had carried her through 25 years of military service cracked like glass under pressure. "That's impossible," she said. But she was already moving forward, drawn by the terrible possibility of Rivera's words. Alexis stood frozen as Captain Matthews approached. Her attempts to cover the tattoo abandoned. There was no point now. Too many people had seen. Too many questions were already forming. The secret she'd guarded for 3 years, the identity she'd buried beneath the mundane life of a support specialist, was unraveling with each passing second, like a rope under too much tension. Matthews stopped directly behind her, close enough to read the names etched into the 8 stars. Her sharp intake of breath was audible in the morning silence. Reynolds, Martinez, Chun, Wilson. She read the names slowly, each one a weight on her tongue. These were the ones who didn't make it out. Her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the silent morning, everyone heard every word with crystal clarity. The ones that Spectre couldn't save. Alexis's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs, her body trembling with the effort of maintaining military bearing while her carefully constructed world collapsed around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. "I tried," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep inside, where she kept her darkest memories locked away. "I tried to get them all out, but the ambush, the second IED. I couldn't." Her voice broke entirely, 3 years of guilt and grief pouring out in those few anguished words. The California morning bore witness to pain that had been carried in silence, in shadows, in the careful anonymity of a support uniform that hid the truth of who she really was. Matthews placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, careful to avoid the scarred areas where old wounds had healed into twisted patterns. Her touch was that of a commander who'd sent too many people into harm's way, who understood the weight that survivors carried. "Lieutenant Alexis Morgan," she said formally, using the rank she'd earned and lost. "Spectre." The smallest, toughest operator DevGru ever produced. The gathered SEALs stood in stunned silence as the magnitude of what they were witnessing sank in like leads in their stomachs. This wasn't just any soldier standing before them with her secrets exposed. This was a legend walking among them. A ghost story whispered in ready rooms and officers' clubs across the special operations community. The operator who'd entered hell itself and refused to leave her people behind. The woman who'd been blown apart, pulling her teammates from a shattered building, who'd made trip after trip into the kill zone until her body simply couldn't continue. The operator whose actions had become the stuff of classified briefings and hushed conversations among those cleared to know. Jackson's legs seemed to give out beneath him. He dropped to one knee, not in respect, but in shock so profound it affected his ability to remain standing. His entire worldview, built on the superiority of his SEAL status and his size as a warrior, had just been shattered like glass against concrete. The woman he'd been shoving around, mocking, treating as less than human was a hero whose actions made his own service look like a child's game of soldier. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much for his mind to process. We didn't know," he stammered, but the words were meaningless in the face of what had been revealed. "Of course you didn't know." Matthew's voice turned hard as steel, cutting through the morning air with the precision of a blade, because Lieutenant Morgan chose to disappear. She took responsibility for a mission that went wrong due to intelligence failures. She accepted emotion, gave up her trident and vanished into the support corps to protect classified information about Operation Hammerfall. He looked around at the gathered SEALs, her expression showing exactly what she thought of their earlier behavior. Years of command experience had taught her to read situations quickly, and what she saw disgusted her. She sacrificed everything she'd worked for. "And you?" Her gaze settled on Jackson with laser intensity. "You treated her like garbage because of her size." The weight of Matthew's words settled over the group like a burial shroud. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. But no one moved. They stood frozen in a tableau of revelation and shame, watching as Alexis Morgan, the woman they dismissed as nothing, was revealed as everything they aspired to be. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the training ground. Alexis found herself standing before the same equipment where this revelation had begun. But now she approached not as a support specialist loading gear, but as an operator remembering what it felt like to have purpose instead of shame. Her hand traced the tactical vest with the tenderness of a lover's touch, fingers finding familiar curves and edges that spoke to muscle memory buried but never forgotten. The Kevlar was smooth under her palm, alive with the potential for protection that had once been as natural to her as breathing. "I don't know if I can do it again," she whispered to no one in particular, her voice barely audible above the ocean breeze. "The last time I operated, 8 people didn't come home. The last time I trusted my skills, good people died because I wasn't good enough, fast enough, better enough to save them all." Rivera stood beside her, his presence solid and reassuring, like an anchor in a storm that had been raging for 3 years. "4 people did come home," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "4 families got to say goodbye because of you. That's what you need to remember, Lieutenant. That's what matters." He pulled out a set of keys, the universal symbol of authority. Metal and responsibility combined in a small package that represented everything Alexis had thought she'd lost forever. "The training course needs an instructor for the new tactics we developed after Hammerfall. Interested in taking the role?" Alexis stared at the keys like they were made of plutonium, dangerous and powerful beyond measure. Teaching again meant facing the demons she'd buried beneath layers of support paperwork and mundane routine. It meant accepting that she was an operator, not a failure hiding in the motor pool. The weight of decision pressed down on her like the morning heat, heavy and inescapable. Around them, the crowd had grown larger as word spread through official and unofficial channels, but their presence faded into background noise as Alexis wrestled with a choice that would define the rest of her life. Jackson approached one final time, moving carefully like someone approaching a wounded animal that might lash out at any moment. His entire team stood behind him, their earlier cockiness replaced by something approaching genuine humility born from the ashes of their ignorance. "Lieutenant Morgan," he began formally, the words coming out stiff with unaccustomed respect. I was wrong. Wrong about everything. Wrong about who you are. Wrong about what you've done. Wrong about what you deserve." He reached up to his collar, unpinning his own seal trident with hands that shook slightly. The gesture was theatrical, but seemed genuine as he held it out to her. "I don't deserve to wear this after what I did today. After how I treated a real warrior who's accomplished more than I ever will." Alexis looked at the offered trident, then at the young seal holding it. His face was streaked with tears that carved channels through dust and shame, the cocky attitude of the morning replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "Keep it," she said finally, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "But remember that it's not what makes you a warrior. It's what you do when everything goes wrong. When people are depending on you, when the easy choice is to save yourself, that's what defines you." She turned away from him, but then paused, looking back over her shoulder. "And Lieutenant, next time you see someone you think is beneath you, remember that heroes don't always advertise. Sometimes the most important people are the ones you'd never suspect." The keys felt impossibly heavy in her palm as she closed, her fingers around them. 3 years of running from who she'd been. 3 years of hiding from the weight of survival and the burden of being the one who lived when others died. But maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to remember how to lead. The training course waited, patient as only military institutions can be, ready to lift her back into the world where she belonged. Around her, the California morning continued its ancient rhythm. But everything had changed in the space of a few hours. The woman who had loaded equipment as the sun rose would lead training as a different person entirely. Not because she had changed, but because the world had finally seen who she'd always been. Alexis Morgan, call sign Spectre, walked toward the training area with the fluid grace of someone born to operate. Her inspection of the course was thorough, professional, the movements of an operator whose skills had been honed by years of training and tested by fire. The crowd watched in respectful silence as she prepared to reclaim the purpose that had once been her domain. 3 weeks later, the first class assembled for advanced tactical training. Alexis stood before them, her posture perfect despite the pain that still haunted her nervous system on bad days. The trainees, a mix of experienced operators and promising candidates, watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. At 5'4" and 125 pounds, she was dwarfed by every man in the room. But as she began to speak, her voice carried with the quiet authority that came not from volume, but from absolute certainty. "My name is Lieutenant Alexis Morgan. My call sign is Spectre. And the first thing you need to understand about special operations is that your greatest weapon isn't your size, your strength, or even your equipment." She paused, letting her gaze travel across the room, making eye contact with each trainee. In turn, "It's here," she tapped her temple. "And here," she placed her hand over her heart, "intelligence and courage. Everything else is secondary." A hand went up in the back row. A burly SEAL with the confident air of someone who'd never questioned his place in the hierarchy of warriors. "With all due respect, ma'am, there are physical requirements for a reason. Some missions simply demand physical strength that I don't have." Alexis finished for him, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "Chief Rivera, would you assist me with a demonstration?" Rivera stepped forward from where he'd been observing at the back of the room. At 6'2" and 220 pounds of solid muscle, he was the physical embodiment of what most people pictured when they thought of a SEAL. "Chief Rivera outweighs me by nearly 100 pounds. He can bench press 3 times what I can. By every measurable physical metric, he should be able to neutralize me without breaking a sweat." Alexis moved to the center of the training mat. "Chief, please try to subdue me." What followed was a demonstration of skill so precise, so perfectly executed that it seemed choreographed. As Rivera attacked, Alexis moved like water, redirecting his momentum, finding pressure points, and using leverage that had nothing to do with mass and everything to do with understanding the mechanics of the human body. Within seconds, Rivera was face down on the mat, his arm locked in a submission hold that had him tapping out despite his considerable advantage in size and strength. The room fell silent as Alexis helped Rivera to his feet. "Size matters," she acknowledged, looking around the room. "But not in the way you think. Being smaller meant I had to be smarter. I had to learn every vulnerability of the human body because I couldn't rely on brute force. I had to master stealth because I couldn't win direct confrontations. I had to become invisible because I couldn't intimidate." She walked along the line of trainees, her gaze steady and unflinching. "Some of you will fail this course not because you aren't strong enough, but because you rely too much on your strength. Some of you will fail not because you aren't big enough, but because you never learn to use your size as an advantage rather than a limitation." At the back of the room, Captain Matthews watched with approval. The woman speaking with such confidence was a far cry from the broken support specialist they discovered 3 weeks ago. This was Spectre as she was meant to be, a leader, a teacher, someone who turned her own challenges into lessons that could save lives. The training that followed was unlike anything the SEALs had experienced before. Alexis restructured the entire course around principles that challenged conventional thinking about special operations. Instead of focusing exclusively on feats of strength and endurance, she implemented exercises that forced the trainees to rely on their intelligence, adaptability, and teamwork. Physical conditioning remained important, but it was integrated into a holistic approach that emphasized creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. "The enemy doesn't care how many pull-ups you can do," she told them during a particularly grueling simulation. "They care about whether you can think clearly when everything goes wrong. They care about whether you can adapt when your primary plan fails. They care about whether you can make the right decision when there are no good options left. For some of the trainees, the adjustment was difficult. They'd spent their entire careers believing that physical prowess was the foundation of special operations. Being asked to reconsider that belief was like being asked to question gravity. Jackson, who had been assigned to the course as part of his disciplinary action, struggled more than most. His confidence, once his greatest asset, had been shattered by the revelation of who Alexis really was and what she had accomplished. During the third week of training, Alexis found him alone in the equipment room, staring at his gear with the lost expression of someone questioning everything he thought he knew. "Lieutenant," she acknowledged, keeping her voice neutral. "I don't belong here," Jackson said without looking up. "After what I did, how I treated you, I should just resign my commission." Alexis considered him for a long moment before sitting down beside him. "You know what the hardest part of Operation Hammerfall was for me?" she asked quietly. "It wasn't the physical pain. It wasn't even losing my teammates. It was forgiving myself for surviving when better operators didn't." She picked up one of his gloves, examining it with practiced eyes. "I spent 3 years hiding in the support corps because I couldn't face what happened. I couldn't accept that sometimes, no matter how good you are, no matter how hard you try, people die. And sometimes, the people who survive aren't the ones you'd expect." Jackson finally looked at her, his expression raw with unprocessed emotion. "How do you move forward from that kind of failure?" "By recognizing that failure is part of the job," Alexis replied. "By understanding that being an operator isn't about being perfect. It's about learning from your mistakes so you don't repeat them. And right now, you have a choice to make. You can resign and spend the rest of your life wondering what kind of leader you might have become, or you can stay and prove that you're capable of growth." She stood, extending her hand to him. "The course resumes in 10 minutes. Your team is waiting." The transformation in Jackson over the following weeks was remarkable. The arrogant bully who had tormented Alexis on the training ground was replaced by a thoughtful leader who pushed himself harder than anyone else. He stopped relying solely on his physical advantages and began developing the mental and emotional tools that separated good operators from great ones. By the final week of the course, when Alexis announced the capstone exercise, Jackson had emerged as one of the strongest candidates. The exercise itself was a grueling 72-hour simulation of a hostage rescue operation, complicated by changing parameters, equipment failures, and ethical dilemmas designed to push the trainees beyond their limits. "This scenario is based on a real operation," Alexis told them as they prepared their gear. "Some of you will fail, some of you will excel. All of you will learn something about yourselves that you didn't know before." What followed was the most challenging test of their careers. Sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, and psychological pressure combined to create conditions that broke some trainees and forged others into something stronger. Jackson's team found themselves cut off from support, their primary exfiltration route compromised, with 2 simulated casualties requiring immediate medical attention. The obvious solution was to leave the casualties behind and save the remainder of the team, a decision that would have been tactically sound according to conventional wisdom. Instead, Jackson made the call to split his team, sending the strongest operators ahead with the rescued hostages while he stayed behind with the casualties, knowing it increased his own risk of capture. When the exercise concluded, Alexis gathered the trainees for the final evaluation. One by one, she addressed their performance, highlighting areas of strength and opportunities for improvement. When she reached Jackson, she paused, studying him with an intensity that made the room fall silent. "Lieutenant Jackson, your decision to stay with the casualties while sending your team ahead was against tactical doctrine. It increased your personal risk and potentially compromised the mission." Her voice was neutral, betraying nothing of what she was thinking. Jackson stood at attention, accepting the criticism without defense. Yes, ma'am. It was also, Alexis continued, exactly the decision I would have made. Because special operations isn't just about completing the mission. It's about bringing everyone home if humanly possible. And sometimes, that means making the hard call that puts your own life at greater risk. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each trainee. The measure of an operator isn't found in physical metrics. It's found in the choices you make when there are no good options left. It's found in your willingness to put others before yourself, to endure when endurance seems impossible, and to keep fighting when everything in you wants to quit. Her gaze returned to Jackson. You've earned your trident, Lieutenant. Not because you're strong or fast or skilled, though you are all those things. You've earned it because you finally understand what it means to lead. The formal graduation ceremony took place the following week, but the real transformation had already occurred in the crucible of training. Alexis stood at the podium, looking out at the faces of operators who had begun as skeptics and ended as believers. 3 years ago, I survived an operation that claimed the lives of 8 of the finest operators I've ever known. For 3 years, I carried the weight of their deaths as a personal failure proof that I wasn't good enough, strong enough, or worthy enough to wear the trident. She touched the insignia on her chest, feeling its weight and meaning in a way she hadn't allowed herself to for too long. I was wrong. What happened in Somalia wasn't a failure of strength or skill. It was a reminder that in our line of work, courage and sacrifice sometimes aren't enough. That we can do everything right and still lose people we care about. The audience listened in respectful silence, many of them nodding in understanding. They had all faced similar moments of doubt, similar questions about their own worthiness. But what I've learned from all of you over these past weeks is that our greatest strength isn't found in what we can physically do. It's found in our ability to adapt, to overcome, to refuse to be defined by our limitations. She gestured to the graduates seated before her. Look around you. The operators in this room come in different sizes, different shapes, with different strengths and weaknesses. But what unites them, what unites all of us, is the understanding that special operations is ultimately about heart, about the willingness to give everything for the person next to you, regardless of the cost. Alexis stepped away from the podium, standing tall despite her small stature. Size doesn't matter in war. Courage does. Intelligence does. Adaptability does. And most importantly, the bond between operators does. That's the lesson of Operation Hammerfall. That's the legacy of the 8 stars on my back. And that's what each of you will carry forward from this day. As the ceremony concluded and the newly certified operators filed out, Captain Matthews approached Alexis with a formal envelope bearing the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Command. This came through this morning, Matthews said, handing her the envelope. Your full reinstatement to active operator status, effective immediately. Your medical clearance was approved last week. Alexis took the envelope, feeling its weight in her hands. 3 years of exile, of hiding from who she really was, ended with a few sheets of paper and a signature. There's more, Matthews continued, a rare smile breaking through her professional demeanor. DevGru is forming a new team, specialized in adaptive tactics for complex urban environments. They need a commander who understands that conventional approaches don't always work. Someone who knows how to turn limitations into advantages. The implication hung in the air between them, an opportunity that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Are you offering me command? Alexis asked, not quite believing what she was hearing. Matthews nodded. Operation Hammerfall changed the way we think about special operations. It showed us that sometimes the unexpected operator is exactly what a mission needs. Your experience, both in Somalia and in the years since, makes you uniquely qualified to lead this team. For a moment, Alexis was transported back to that terrible night in Somalia, the heat, the chaos, the impossible choices, the weight of responsibility. But this time, the memory didn't crush her. This time, she saw it for what it was, not a failure, but a forge that had shaped her into the leader she was meant to become. "I'll need to select my own team," she said, already mentally reviewing candidates who had shown the kind of adaptability and creative thinking the new unit would require. "You'll have full authority over personnel selection," Matthews confirmed. "The only question is, are you ready to step back into the field? Not just as an operator, but as a commander responsible for the lives of others?" Alexis thought of the memorial tattoo on her back, of the 8 stars that represented not just loss, but also purpose. For 3 years she had carried them as a burden of failure. Perhaps now it was time to carry them as a reminder of why her work mattered. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady with the certainty of someone who had finally found her way back to where she belonged. As she walked across the training ground where her journey of redemption had begun, Alexis felt lighter than she had in years. The pain was still there, both physical and emotional, but it no longer defined her. It was simply part of who she was, one thread in the complex tapestry of experiences that had made her not just an operator, but a leader. The California sun cast her shadow long across the ground, a shadow much larger than her physical form would suggest. Just as it should be. Because in the world of special operations, as in life itself, it wasn't size that cast the longest shadow. It was courage, resilience, and the willingness to stand tall, even when everything tried to make you small. 6 months after taking command of the specialized Deviguru Tima, officially designated as Tactical Adaptive Response Unit, but informally known as Phantom's Lieutenant, Alexis Morgan stood on the deck of the USS Boxer, watching the sun rise over the Arabian Sea. The pre-dawn light cast everything in shades of purple and gold, transforming the military vessel into something almost ethereal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her team was scattered across the carrier group, each member going through their personal pre-mission rituals. Some cleaned their weapons with mechanical precision, others studied intelligence reports one final time, and a few sought the quiet solitude that allowed them to center themselves before stepping into the unknown. The mission ahead was the kind that made Pentagon officials lose sleep. A high-value intelligence asset doctor for Rita Karim, a nuclear physicist who had been working with American intelligence, had been captured by an emerging terrorist faction in Yemen. Dr. Karim possessed information that could potentially compromise nuclear security protocols across 3 continents. Intelligence suggested she was being held in a heavily fortified compound in the mountains near Taiz, an area notoriously difficult to access and even harder to escape from. Conventional assault tactics would likely result in the asset's execution before extraction could be completed. It was precisely the kind of impossible scenario that the Phantoms had been created to address. Thinking about Somalia? The voice belonged to Chief Petty Officer Marcus Delgado, her second in command and the only member of the team who knew the full details of Operation Hammerfall. He joined her at the railing, his massive frame dwarfing her slight figure in a visual contrast that had become the unofficial emblem of their unconventional unit. Always, Alexis admitted, watching as the golden disk of the sun emerged fully above the horizon. But differently now. She had selected Delgado as her second, not just for his physical capabilities, though at 6 feet 3 inches and built like a linebacker, he could certainly handle himself, but for his mind. A former chess champion with degrees in both psychology and mechanical engineering, he represented the blend of physical prowess and intellectual agility that defined the new unit. "Different how?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear him. "Before, I remembered the failures, what I couldn't do, who I couldn't save. Alexis traced the scar on her forearm, a habit she'd developed when deep in thought. Now I remember the lessons. What worked, what didn't, what I'd do differently. Delgado nodded, understanding the shift in perspective that had transformed his commander from a haunted survivor into one of the most innovative tactical minds in special operations. "The team's ready," he said after a moment. Jackson completed the final equipment modifications last night. Chun finished her analysis of the compound's blind spots. Rivera ran through the extraction simulation, one more time shaved another 42 seconds off our exit window. Jackson had been the first operator Alexis had recruited, a decision that raised eyebrows throughout Naval Special Warfare Command. The man who had once tormented her for her size was now her most devoted team member, having recognized that his previous approach to special operations had been fundamentally flawed. "And you?" Alexis turned to face him fully, studying the calm confidence in his eyes. "Are you ready to rewrite the playbook on hostage extraction?" A slow smile spread across Delgado's face. "That's what we do, isn't it? The impossible missions. The ones where conventional thinking gets people killed." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "That's what we do," she agreed, turning back to the rising sun. "Meet me in the tactical room in 20. I want to go over the infiltration sequence one more time." As Delgado departed, Alexis remained at the railing, allowing herself these final moments of solitude before the mission consumed her full attention. The phantoms represented everything she had learned about special operations since Somalia, that sometimes the greatest advantage came not from overwhelming force, but from redefining the rules of engagement entirely. Her team consisted of 8 operators, each selected not just for their physical capabilities, but for qualities that conventional SEAL training often overlooked: creativity, adaptability, emotional intelligence, and the ability to think beyond established doctrine when the situation demanded it. Lieutenant Jackson, once the embodiment of traditional SEAL machismo, had transformed into an equipment specialist who could modify standard gear into solutions for seemingly impossible challenges. His physical strength remained an asset, but it was his growing technical creativity that had earned him a place among the phantoms. Petty Officer Chun, barely 5 feet 5 and perpetually underestimated, had a mind that processed spatial relationships with computer-like precision. She could identify structural weaknesses, lines of sight, and tactical opportunities in environments where others saw only obstacles. Chief Rivera, with his 2 decades of experience, provided the institutional knowledge that balanced the team's innovative approach with hard-earned wisdom about what worked when theory met reality. The remaining 4 members, Wilson, Patel, Nguyen, and Torres, each brought unique skills that complemented the team's philosophy that special operations success came not from following a template, but from adapting to the specific demands of each mission. Together, they had spent 6 months redefining what was possible in the world of special operations, completing 3 missions that conventional wisdom had deemed too risky to attempt. Their methods were unorthodox, their approach often controversial, but their results spoke for themselves. 3 successful extractions with 0 casualties. Today's mission would test everything they had built together. The tactical room was already buzzing with focused energy when Alexis arrived. The team gathered around a 3-dimensional holographic display of the target compound, studying it from angles impossible to achieve with traditional models. "Final briefing," Alexis announced, her voice instantly commanding the room's attention despite its quiet tone. "Dr. Kareem has been in captivity for 72 hours. Intelligence suggests interrogation has begun, but remains in preliminary stages. Our window is closing. They'll likely move her within the next 12 hours. She manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on the northern approach to the compound. Standard doctrine would call for a direct assault from multiple entry points, overwhelming force to clear the building room by room. The display shifted to show such an assault in simulation: red figures representing operators, blue representing hostiles with a yellow indicator for the hostage. In the simulation, the yellow figure disappeared before extraction could be completed. That approach gets our asset killed before we reach her, Alexis continued. So we're not going to do it that way. With another gesture, she shifted the display to show an entirely different approach, one that involved no direct assault at all. We're going to let them extract her themselves. For the next hour, Alexis walked the team through a plan so unconventional that it bordered on the revolutionary. Instead of fighting their way in, they would manipulate the situation to force the captors to move Dr. Karim of their own accord, following a path that the phantoms would control without ever revealing their presence until the moment of extraction. It was a plan that relied not on superior firepower, but on psychological understanding of the enemy, environmental manipulation, and precision timing. It required each team member to operate independently while maintaining perfect coordination, trusting their training and each other when direct communication would be impossible. Questions? Alexis asked when she had finished. It's never been done before, Nguyen observed, though his tone conveyed excitement rather than doubt. Creating an invisible corridor of extraction through enemy territory without engaging directly. That's why we exist, Alexis reminded him. To do what's never been done before when the alternative is failure. Torres raised his hand, his expression thoughtful. The timing has to be perfect. If any element is off by even 30 seconds, then we adapt, Alexis finished for him. That's our name, that's our purpose. We plan for precision but prepare for adaptation. She looked around the room, meeting each operator's eyes in turn. This isn't just about saving one asset. It's about proving that special operations can evolve beyond brute force solutions. It's about showing that intelligence, creativity, and precision can accomplish what missiles and direct assault cannot. The team nodded, understanding the larger significance of what they were attempting. In a world increasingly defined by complex threats and environments, where conventional military approaches created as many problems as they solved, the phantoms represented a new paradigm, one that prioritized surgical precision over overwhelming force. Gear up, Alexis ordered. Wheels up in 30. As the team dispersed to make their final preparations, Captain Matthews entered the tactical room, her expression unreadable. Walk me through it one more time, she requested, studying the holographic display with the experienced eye of someone who had spent decades evaluating operation plans. Alexis complied, explaining each phase of the unorthodox approach. When she finished, Matthews was silent for a long moment, considering the implications of what she had just heard. 3 years ago, this plan wouldn't have been possible, the captain finally said. Not because the technology didn't exist or the intelligence wasn't available, but because no one would have thought to approach the problem this way. She turned to face Alexis directly. Somalia changed you. Most people would have been broken by what happened there. You used it to reforge yourself into something new, something the naval special warfare community desperately needed but didn't know to ask for. I had good teachers, Alexis replied, thinking of the 8 stars tattooed on her back. They taught me that sometimes survival depends not on being the strongest, but on being the most adaptable. Matthews nodded, understanding the reference. To the fallen operators whose memory Alexis carried with her always, bring Dr. Karim home, she said simply. And bring your team home with her. That's the plan, ma'am. The extraction operation began at 0200 local time, under the cover of a moonless night that draped the Yemeni mountains in profound darkness. Unlike traditional SEAL operations, there was no dramatic helicopter insertion, no fast roping into hostile territory. Instead, the phantoms infiltrated in pairs over the course of 6 hours, moving so carefully through the rugged terrain that even local wildlife remained undisturbed by their passage. By mid-morning, all 8 operators were in position invisible. Presences surrounding the compound, connected by encrypted communication devices that transmitted through bone conduction rather than traditional radio signals. Phase 1 began with Jackson and Torres deploying modified drones barely larger than hummingbirds to map the compound's interior through thermal and vibrational analysis. The data they gathered confirmed Dr. Karim's location in the central building and revealed the pattern of guard rotations. Phase 2 was Chun's specialty environmental manipulation. Using a combination of localized electromagnetic pulses and targeted interference with the compound's water and electrical systems, she created a series of cascading infrastructure failures that would force the captors to relocate their valuable prisoner. Targets are moving. Chun's voice came through the bone conduction system, barely more than a whisper. Primary subject is being transferred to Vehicle 2 as predicted. Confirm visual. Alexis responded from her position, overlooking the compound's eastern exit. Through her advanced optics, she watched as Dr. Karim was hurried from the main building toward an armored SUV. The physicist appeared physically unharmed, but moved with the stiff caution of someone under extreme stress. Corridors prepared, Delgado confirmed. All checkpoints are set. What followed was a masterpiece of indirect influence. As the convoy carrying Dr. Karim departed the compound, they encountered a series of subtle manipulations of their environment. Rockslide that blocked the primary road, forcing them onto a secondary path. A local shepherd who unwittingly delayed them at precisely the right moment. Electronic failures that prevented communication with their base. Each event appeared random, unconnected to the others. But together, they formed an invisible corridor that channeled the convoy toward the one location where extraction could occur with minimal risk to the asset. Target approaching final checkpoint, Rivera reported. Convoy is intact, moving at 40 kilometers per hour. Asset in second vehicle, rear seat, right side. Execute Phase 3, Alexis ordered, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Phase 3 was where conventional and unconventional tactics merged, a precisely timed ambush that disabled the convoy without putting Dr. Karim at risk, followed by an extraction so rapid that the captors had no time to execute contingency plans. The operation that had begun at 0200 concluded at 1422, with Dr. Karim secured aboard a waiting extraction vessel and all 8 Phantoms accounted for without a single casualty on either side. The entire extraction phase had lasted less than 2 minutes, a testament to the months of planning, training, and innovation that had gone into creating an entirely new approach to hostage rescue. As the extraction vessel sped toward the rendezvous point with the USS Boxer, Dr. Karim sat wrapped in a thermal blanket, sipping water and studying the operators who had rescued her with the analytical gaze of a scientist observing an unexpected phenomenon. "You're not what I expected," she finally said, addressing Alexis directly. "When they told me Devegru might attempt extraction, I imagined something different." Alexis understood the unspoken observation. At 5'4", dressed in modified tactical gear that emphasized mobility over bulk, she hardly matched the popular image of a SEAL operator. "We're what Special Operations is becoming, Dr. Karim," she replied. "Adaptable, precise, focused on achieving objectives through intelligence rather than force whenever possible." The physicist nodded slowly, her scientist's mind appreciating the evolution. Like water finding the path of least resistance. "Exactly like that," Alexis agreed, recognizing the perfect metaphor for what the Phantoms represented. Water seemingly soft and yielding, yet capable of reshaping mountains given enough time and persistence. Water adapting to any container. Finding paths through obstacles that seemed impenetrable. Water underestimated until it demonstrated its quiet, inexorable power. When they returned to the USS Boxer, the reception was subdued compared to the traditional celebrations that often followed successful high-risk operations. There were no cheers, no dramatic recounting of close calls or heroic moments. Instead, there was the quiet satisfaction of professionals who had executed their mission exactly as planned, without the chaos or casualties that so often accompanied even successful operations. Captain Matthews met them on the flight deck, shaking each operator's hand before personally escorting Dr. Kareem to secure quarters where intelligence officers waited to debrief her. The Secretary of Defense was monitoring the operation, Matthews informed Alexis when she returned. His exact words were, "I've never seen anything like it." "That was the point," Alexis replied. "To show what's possible when we stop thinking about special operations as simply applying more force with more precision, and start thinking about reshaping the entire approach to achieving objectives." Matthews studied her former protégé with undisguised pride. "The after-action report is going to change doctrine throughout the special operations community. You know that, right?" Alexis nodded, understanding the broader implications of what the Phantoms had demonstrated. "That's what the 8 stars on my back demanded. Not just that I survive, but that I ensure their sacrifice led to something better. Something that might save others from facing the same impossible choices we faced in Somalia." Later that night, alone in her quarters, Alexis sat on the edge of her bunk and allowed herself to feel the weight of the day. The operation had been flawless, as perfect an execution of a new tactical philosophy as could be imagined. Yet beneath the professional satisfaction was something deeper, more personal. For the first time since Somalia, she had led a team into hostile territory and brought everyone home safely. The ghost of failure that had haunted her for 3 years had not disappeared. Those 8 stars would always be part of her, but it had transformed into something that propelled her forward, rather than holding her back. A knock at her door interrupted her reflection. She opened it to find her team gathered in the corridor, led by Jackson holding what appeared to be a hastily constructed model of the Yemeni compound fashioned from materials scrounged from around the ship. "We thought you might want this," he said, presenting the model with a mixture of solemnity and barely contained excitement. "First successful implementation of the Morgan Doctrine." "The what?" Alexis asked, taking the model with a bemused expression. "That's what they're calling it back at command," Delgado explained. "The Morgan Doctrine Adaptive Infiltration. Psychological manipulation of the operational environment and precision extraction with minimal direct engagement." Alexis turned the model in her hands, studying the crude but accurate representation of the compound and the surrounding terrain. What made it special wasn't its craftsmanship, but what it represented, a fundamental shift in how special operations could be conducted. "We made history today," Chun said quietly. "Not just completing the mission, but showing there's a different way to approach problems that seemed unsolvable." "It wasn't just me," Alexis reminded them, looking around at the team that had made the seemingly impossible operation possible. "Each of you brought something essential to this new approach. But it took someone who understood that different isn't lesser to bring us together," Rivera pointed out. "Someone who had experienced firsthand why the old ways sometimes fail, and had the courage to imagine new ones." The moment might have turned sentimental if Torres hadn't broken the mood with his characteristic bluntness. Plus, the looks on those guys' faces when they realized they'd been maneuvered into our extraction point without firing a shot priceless. The team laughed, tension releasing in a wave of shared accomplishment and relief. Tomorrow would bring debriefings, reports, and the inevitable scrutiny that accompanied innovation in an institution as tradition-bound as the military. But tonight was for acknowledging what they had achieved together. As her team departed to find their own rest, Alexis placed the model on the small desk in her quarters, next to the photograph of her original Devigru team, the one that had been partially destroyed in the fire that claimed 8 of her brothers and sisters in arms. The contrast between the two objects struck her as profoundly significant. The photo represented the past, what had been lost but never forgotten. The model represented the future, what could be built from the lessons of that loss. "We did it," she whispered to the faces in the photograph, some clear, others obscured. "My fire damage. We found a better way." And in that moment, the weight of the 8 stars on her back felt not like a burden of failure, but like the steady pressure of hands supporting her, urging her forward toward a future where the lessons written in their sacrifice might save countless others who followed in their footsteps. The Morgan Doctrine wasn't just a tactical innovation. It was a memorial more meaningful than any tattoo could ever be, a living testament to operators who had given everything, transformed by one survivor into a legacy that would reshape the very nature of special operations for generations to come. The return to Naval Special Warfare Command was met with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and grudging respect. What the Phantoms had accomplished in Yemen had traveled through the Special Operations community with the speed of a brushfire, igniting debates in ready rooms and officers' clubs about the future of tactical doctrine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 2 years after the formation of the unit, Alexis found herself standing before the Naval Special Warfare Advisory Board, preparing to defend what had become known throughout the military as the Morgan Doctrine. The room was filled with seasoned commanders whose careers had been built on conventional special operations, approaches men who viewed innovation with the cautious skepticism that came from having seen too many revolutionary tactics fail. When theory met reality, Lieutenant Morgan, Admiral Harrington began, his voice carrying the gravitas of 4 decades in naval service. "Your team has completed 12 operations in the past 2 years using methodologies that deviate significantly from established doctrine. Your after-action reports suggest these methods have resulted in a 100% success rate with 0 friendly casualties and minimal enemy casualties." He leaned forward, studying her with piercing blue eyes that had evaluated countless officers throughout his career. "What I want to know is whether these results can be replicated by other teams, or if they're dependent on your specific personnel and leadership." It was the question at the heart of the debate, whether the Morgan Doctrine represented a transferable evolution in special operations, or merely a unique approach developed by a uniquely talented team. "Sir, the principles are universally applicable," Alexis replied, her quiet confidence filling the room despite her slight stature. "What we've developed isn't a set of tactics so much as a framework for approaching complex problems. The specific methods will vary based on the mission parameters, but the underlying philosophy can be taught and implemented by any properly trained team." Admiral Harrington exchanged glances with the other board members. "And that philosophy is that the application of force should be our last option, not our first," Alexis explained. "That understanding the psychological, environmental, and tactical landscapes allows us to shape situations to our advantage rather than simply reacting to them. That the objective isn't just mission completion, but achieving that completion with minimal risk to our operators, civilians, and even adversaries when possible." Captain Lee, one of the younger board members, leaned forward. "And you believe this approach can be effective against high-level threats? Against enemies who are sophisticated, well-equipped, and prepared for conventional special operations tactics?" "With respect, Captain, it's precisely against those enemies that our approach has proven most effective," Alexis responded. "The Yemen extraction, the Manila intelligence operation, the Caracas asset recovery, all of these involved sophisticated adversaries who were prepared for conventional assaults, but were completely unprepared for indirect manipulation of their operational environment." She activated the holographic display at the center of the conference table, bringing up 3-dimensional renderings of the operations she had referenced. Traditional special operations doctrine relies heavily on our superior training, equipment, and tactical execution. It assumes that if we move faster, shoot more accurately, and execute with greater precision, we will prevail. And often, we do. But against enemies who have studied our playbook, who have prepared specifically for our standard approaches, that advantage diminishes. The display shifted to show the Yemen operation in detailed simulation, the subtle manipulations of infrastructure, the calculated environmental changes, the precision timing that had channeled the enemy into a position of vulnerability, without them ever realizing they were being manipulated. The Morgan Doctrine doesn't replace traditional capabilities. It augments them by adding layers of psychological and environmental manipulation that the enemy can't prepare for because they don't recognize them as tactical elements. For the next hour, Alexis walked the board through the principles that had guided the Phantom's operations, principles that challenged decades of established doctrine while acknowledging the fundamental truths that had made special operations effective. Throughout history, when she concluded, the room fell silent as the board members absorbed what they had heard. It was Admiral Harrington who finally broke the silence. "What you're proposing isn't just a tactical evolution," he observed. "It's a philosophical one. You're suggesting that the future of special operations lies not in becoming more lethal, but in becoming more intelligent about when and how lethality is applied." "Yes, sir," Alexis confirmed. "The most successful operation is one where we achieve our objective without the enemy ever realizing they were outmaneuvered until it's too late. Where superior intelligence, planning, and psychological insight replace the need for superior firepower in most scenarios." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The board's decision came 3 weeks later. The Morgan Doctrine would be formally incorporated into the SEAL training curriculum, with Alexis and her team developing the initial modules for testing with select operators. It represented official recognition of what many in the special operations community had already acknowledged, that the future belonged to those who could adapt not just their tactics, but their entire conceptual approach to warfare. As Alexis left the meeting where the decision had been announced, she found Jackson waiting in the corridor, his expression a mixture of pride and something more complex. "Congratulations, Lieutenant," he said formally, though the gleam in his eyes betrayed his excitement. "The Morgan Doctrine is officially part of SEAL history." "Our doctrine," she corrected him. Every member of the Phantoms contributed to its development. They walked together toward the training grounds where the rest of the team was conducting drills with a group of candidates for the expanded program. The naval base spread out below them, a complex ecosystem of training facilities, administrative buildings, and support structures all dedicated to producing the world's most effective special operators. "I've been thinking about Somalia," Jackson said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had developed between them. Alexis glanced at him, surprised by the reference to the operation that had defined so much of her life. In the 2 years they had worked together, Jackson had rarely mentioned it directly, respecting the private nature of her experience there. "What about it?" she asked carefully. "I've been thinking about what would have happened if the Phantoms had been there, if the Morgan Doctrine had existed then." He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I've run simulations, studied the after-action reports, analyzed every variable I could find. And," Alexis prompted when he fell silent, "and I believe all 8 operators would have survived," he said quietly, the weight of his conclusion evident in his voice. "The approach we've developed, the emphasis on environmental analysis, psychological profiling, adaptive infiltration, it would have identified the ambush points, recognized the secondary triggers, created alternative extraction routes." The statement hung between them, heavy with implications. For 3 years, Alexis had carried the weight of those 8 deaths as a personal failure. The suggestion that a different approach might have prevented the tragedy struck at the core of her identity as both a survivor and a leader. Maybe, she acknowledged, her voice tight with emotion she rarely allowed herself to display. But we can't know for certain, and we can't change what happened. Jackson nodded, accepting the boundary she had established. No, we can't. But we can honor them by ensuring it doesn't happen again. That's what the Morgan Doctrine really is, a memorial in methodology. A way of ensuring that their sacrifice leads to a future where fewer operators face the same impossible choices. The insight was so profound, so perfectly aligned with what Alexis had been working toward, without fully articulating it, even to herself, that for a moment she couldn't respond. Jackson had captured the essence of her mission in a way that transcended tactics and touched on the deeper purpose that had driven her since emerging from the shadows of support duty. That's exactly what it is, she finally said, the tension in her voice replaced by quiet certainty. A memorial in methodology, a way of honoring the fallen by protecting the living. They resumed their walk toward the training grounds, each lost in their own thoughts but connected by the shared understanding of what their work truly meant beyond the tactical innovations and operational successes. The training area came into view, a sprawling complex of urban warfare simulators, rappelling towers, and maritime assault courses. In the central courtyard, the original Phantoms were leading small groups of SEAL candidates through exercises designed to develop the cognitive and adaptive skills that underpin the Morgan Doctrine. Look at that, Jackson murmured, nodding toward the far corner of the yard. There, Chief Rivera was working with a female candidate who couldn't have been more than 5'12". She was moving through an obstacle course designed to test tactical decision-making. Under pressure, her smaller frame navigating spaces that larger operators would have struggled to access. 3 years ago, she wouldn't have made it past the first round of selection, Jackson observed. Not because she isn't capable, but because the criteria were designed around a specific physical archetype that presumed effectiveness could only look one way. Alexis watched as the candidate completed the course in record time, her approach demonstrating exactly the kind of adaptive thinking the Morgan Doctrine emphasized. And now we understand that effectiveness isn't measured in inches or pounds, Jackson replied. It's measured in adaptability, intelligence, and the ability to solve problems in ways the enemy can't anticipate. The transformation in Jackson over the past 2 years had been one of Alexis's greatest sources of professional pride. The arrogant bully who had mocked her size had become one of the most vocal advocates for diversity in special operations, not as a social initiative, but as a tactical advantage. He had recognized that different perspectives, different physical capabilities, and different approaches to problem solving created a more effective fighting force than uniformity ever could. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Matthews, her expression uncharacteristically animated. "Lieutenant Morgan, a word," she requested, gesturing Alexis away from the training area. When they were out of earshot of the others, Matthews handed her a sealed envelope bearing the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Command. "This came directly from Admiral Harrington's office. I thought you should see it immediately." Alexis opened the envelope, scanning the contents with growing disbelief. The document outlined plans for the expansion of the Phantom program into a full-fledged training division, with Alexis slated for promotion to lieutenant commander and appointment as its first director. "They're not just adopting the doctrine," Matthews explained, unable to contain her satisfaction. "They're restructuring significant portions of SEAL training around it. The Admiral believes it represents the future of special operations in increasingly complex theaters where conventional approaches create as many problems as they solve." Alexis reread the document, struggling to absorb the implications. What had begun as an experimental unit born from her personal trauma had evolved into a fundamental shift in how the entire special operations community approached its mission. "There's more," Matthews continued. The Secretary of Defense has personally requested a briefing on the Morgan Doctrine. There's interest in adapting elements of it for implementation across all special operations forces, not just naval special warfare. The magnitude of the moment washed over Alexis like a physical wave. 3 years ago, she had been hiding in plain sight, a broken operator relegated to support duties, carrying the weight of 8 deaths as her personal burden. Now she stood at the precipice of transforming how America's most elite warriors prepared for and executed their missions. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "This is about the entire team. About everyone who believed in a different approach when conventional wisdom said it couldn't work." Matthews nodded, understanding the importance of acknowledging the collective effort that had made this moment possible. "Of course, the briefing is scheduled for next month. You'll want your key personnel there to represent the various aspects of the doctrine." As Matthews departed to attend to other duties, Alexis found herself alone with the document that represented the culmination of a journey that had begun in the worst moment of her life. The path from Somalia to this moment had not been linear or easy, but it had been purposeful, each step guided by the determination to ensure that the sacrifice of 8 operators would lead to something meaningful. She made her way to a quiet spot overlooking the Pacific Ocean, needing a moment to process the implications of what was happening. The water stretched to the horizon, its surface constantly shifting with the interplay of wind and current, and a PT metaphor for the dynamic nature of the doctrine that bore her name. A presence beside her broke her reverie. Rivera had followed her, his weathered face showing concern for her sudden departure from the training area. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who had seen enough of life to take both triumphs and setbacks in stride. Wordlessly, Alexis handed him the document. As he read it, his expression shifted from concern to surprise, to a quiet pride that spoke volumes about their journey together. "They're really doing it," he said when he finished reading. "They're changing the entire approach because of what we built together. Because of Somalia," Alexis corrected gently. "Because 8 stars on my back demanded something better than what we had." Rivera nodded, understanding the connection between past tragedy and future transformation. "You know, when I first saw that tattoo on the training ground, I thought I was seeing a ghost. Not just because Spectre was supposedly dead, but because I couldn't believe anyone could survive what you went through and still have the courage to keep fighting, just in a different way." He handed the document back to her, his expression solemn. "Those 8 stars aren't just a memorial anymore. They're a constellation guiding an entire generation of operators towards something better." The metaphor struck Alexis with unexpected force. The idea that the memorial she carried was not just a record of loss, but a guide for the future. That the weight she had borne for so long had transformed into a light that could lead others. "A constellation," she repeated softly, finding profound truth in the image. "I never thought of it that way." As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting golden light across the naval base where the next generation of special operators was being trained in principles that would have seemed revolutionary just years before, Alexis felt a sense of completion that had eluded her since Somalia. Not an end to her mission. There was still so much work to be done, but a recognition that the path she had chosen had led to something meaningful, something that transcended her personal journey. 3 months later, Alexis stood in the Pentagon briefing room, preparing to present the Morgan Doctrine to the highest levels of military leadership. Behind her, the original Phantoms waited in parade rest, each representing an essential aspect of the approach that had redefined special operations. As she looked out at the assembled leadership, the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense, representatives from every branch of special operations, she saw not just the present, but the future they were building together. A future where special operations wasn't defined solely by physical prowess or overwhelming force, but by intelligence, adaptability, and precision. The Morgan Doctrine began with a simple question, she started, her voice carrying clearly despite its quiet tone. What if our greatest strength isn't our ability to dominate through force, but our ability to shape outcomes through understanding? The presentation that followed was not just a tactical briefing, but a vision for the evolution of special operations in an increasingly complex world. She outlined how the approach had been tested in 12 high-risk operations, each successful. Where conventional methods had been deemed too dangerous or unlikely to succeed. When she concluded, the Secretary of Defense rose from his seat, studying her with the evaluating gaze of someone who had spent decades making decisions that shaped national security. "Lieutenant Commander Morgan," he said, using her newly confirmed rank, "what you've presented here isn't just a tactical evolution. It's a paradigm shift in how we conceptualize special operations. And like all paradigm shifts, it will face resistance from those invested in the status quo." He glanced around the room, acknowledging the mix of enthusiasm and skepticism visible on the faces of the assembled leadership. "But what impresses me most isn't the tactical innovations, though those are significant. It's the philosophy underlying them, the recognition that in today's conflicts, the most powerful weapon isn't the one that creates the biggest explosion, but the one that achieves the objective with the least collateral damage, the least risk to our operators, and the least opportunity for unforeseen consequences." He turned back to Alexis, his expression reflecting a decision already made. "The Morgan Doctrine will be implemented across all special operations forces, adapted as necessary for each branch's specific mission parameters. Your team will serve as the core training cadre during the transition." As the briefing concluded, and the senior leadership filed out of the room, Alexis remained at the podium, momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just been set in motion. The doctrine that had begun as her personal quest to give meaning to tragedy had become official policy, a transformation of how America's most elite warriors would approach their most critical missions. One by one, her team approached, each offering silent congratulations through gestures that meant more than words ever could, a hand on her shoulder, a nod of respect, the quiet acknowledgement of a journey completed together. Jackson was the last to approach, standing at attention before her with an uncharacteristic formality that suggested he had something important to say. "Lieutenant Commander," he began, using her new rank with evident pride. "Permission to speak freely?" "Always," Alexis replied, curious about his sudden formality. "I've been selected for the first expansion team," he informed her. "I'll be leading implementation of the Morgan Doctrine with Army Special Forces." The news was both expected and bittersweet. Jackson had become her most trusted operator, a transformation so complete from their first encounter that it seemed almost mythological in its arc from antagonist to ally. "They couldn't have chosen better," she told him sincerely. "You understand the doctrine from the inside out, not just how it works, but why it matters." Jackson nodded, accepting the compliment with the humility that had replaced his former arrogance. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice dropping so that only she could hear him. "Not just for the opportunity or the training, but for showing me what real strength looks like. For proving that sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the biggest or the loudest, but the one with the clearest vision of what's possible." The words touched Alexis deeply, not because she needed validation, but because they represented the fulfillment of a promise she had made to herself in the aftermath of Somalia, that she would transform her experience into something that changed not just tactics but minds, that challenged not just procedures but perspectives. "Carry it forward," she told him, reaching out to shake his hand in the formal gesture that masked the depth of their shared journey. "Make it better, adapt it. That's what the doctrine is all about, constant evolution based on new information and changing circumstances." As Jackson departed to prepare for his new assignment, Alexis found herself alone in the briefing room. surrounded by the remnants of the presentation that had formalized her life's work. On the screen behind her, the final slide remained. Simple graphics showing the interconnected principles of the Morgan doctrine, arranged in a pattern that subtly evoked the constellation metaphor Rivera had used months earlier. 8 points of light, connected by lines of methodology and philosophy, forming a guide for the future of special operations. 8 stars, no longer just memorializing the fallen, but illuminating the path forward for those who followed. The memorial tattoo on her back seemed lighter somehow, as if the weight of grief had been partially transformed into the buoyancy of purpose fulfilled. The 8 stars would always represent loss, but now they also represented legacy, a tangible change in how America's special operators approach their most dangerous missions. A change that would save lives on both sides of future conflicts. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave the Pentagon, Alexis reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the shattered operator hiding in support duties to the architect of a doctrine that would shape special operations for decades to come. From a survivor defined by tragedy to a leader defined by transformation. The path had not been easy or direct. It had required facing her deepest fears, challenging established orthodoxy, and finding strength in what others perceived as weakness. But standing here now, with the Morgan doctrine officially recognized and her team preparing to share its principles throughout the special operations community, she knew that every step had been necessary. Those 8 stars on her back had demanded nothing less than a revolution, not just in how special operations were conducted, but in who could conduct them and what defined success. They had demanded a future where the best operator wasn't necessarily the biggest or the strongest, but the most adaptable, the most intelligent, the most capable of seeing solutions where others saw only obstacles. And in fulfilling that demand, Alexis had not only honored the fallen, but created a legacy that would protect the living, a constellation guiding special operators through the darkness of future conflicts with a light born from the ashes of past tragedy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.